Welcome to worship, friends and neighbors, brothers and sisters. It's the season of Easter, and God is on the loose in the world and may be with us. In fact, we know God is with us. Will you stand, please, and join in the call to worship? Gracious God, in Jesus Christ, you teach us to love our neighbors, but we build dividing walls of hostility. You show us how to love one another as sisters and brothers, but we hide ourselves from our own human family. You ask us to seek out the stranger and welcome the guest, but we lock ourselves up inside our own fear. You want us to share your abundant gifts with the poor, but we cling tightly to our possessions and our privilege. You call us to proclaim good news to all people, but we waste our words and hide our light. Have mercy on us, loving God. Forgive our sin, open our hearts, and change our lives. Please remain standing and pray with me before we sing. We need you, loving, merciful, and knowing God. We need you in the fullness of your love, in the wonder of your mercy, in the ways you disclose yourself to us in worship and beyond the walls of this sanctuary. Come to us now. In this season of resurrection wonder, we are looking for you among us and all your people. So we say, Amen.
Hear the words from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Hear now a short poem about this tremendous Canaanite woman. She asked, comma, he answered. But in the comma lies a story. Persistence, yes, humility, also openness of heart and mind, hallmarks of real change. She asks, our answer lies in the comma. The Canaanite woman's story is one that we often like to ignore or explain away. It's an uncomfortable story to read and even more difficult to attempt to understand. But for the most part, the story has been read in a particular way. In fact, most Bibles give away this traditional interpretation since they include a subheading saying, "The great faith of the Canaanite woman." So right away, we're looking for some exemplary act of faith. But what kind of faith do we actually see in this story? And does that description get at the whole story? I don't believe it does. Some commentators argue that when Jesus is confronted with the Canaanite woman, he's engaging her in kind of a playful test, where he denies her what she so desperately needs as a test of faith. But this creates an odd image of Jesus and doesn't account for the fact that it is the woman who engages Jesus in conversation. She confronts him. If anything, the narrative suggests that she's testing him. This testing hypothesis also makes Jesus seem cruel for toying with a woman who is desperately trying to get her daughter healed. I can imagine the hope of this desperate, hurting woman living on the margins. Perhaps she had heard from a neighbor that the Jesus of Nazareth she'd heard so much about had unexpectedly come to their neighborhood. She had surely heard rumors of miracles and stories about the many people who'd been miraculously fed, how he had healed so many possessed by demons or afflicted with diseases. She must have surely thought that this Jesus of Nazareth would be the one to heal her daughter. Given the awful plight of this woman, it makes it difficult to believe that Jesus is toying around with her. It just doesn't seem of Jesus' loving character. But neither does the language that Jesus uses towards her when she repeatedly asks him to heal her daughter. He calls her and her daughter dogs. It's shocking. Some scholars try to take the edge off by saying that this Greek word, kunarion, meaning little dogs, was a playful designation for Gentiles, who were the puppies living on the margins of Israel. But we must not lose the sight of the dehumanization that such a designation entails, and perhaps miss the point of the entire encounter. This designation of dog is not arbitrary or reactionary of Jesus. It instead seems to be truly indicative of how Jesus and his disciples understood his ministry, and also how they understood the social dynamics of first century Palestine. We must remember that the Gospel of Matthew is telling the story of how Jesus fulfills prophecies of the Old Testament and how Jesus is the new Moses who gives us the liberating law of love. But the Canaanite-Israelite relationship has always been ugly. We know the story of Joshua and the violent dispossession of the Canaanites. And yet here is Jesus, a Jewish man, the son of David, the new Moses, and he's confronted by a woman simply known as the Canaanite woman. But there aren't really any Canaanites of that kind around in Jesus' time, so why use this designation? The text doesn't give us any answers, but when taken in concert with Israel's history and Jesus' words about the lost sheep of the house of Israel, I think things start to make a bit more sense to us. If Jesus is coming for the house of Israel, then the Canaanite woman has no business looking to Jesus for assistance, let alone salvation. She simply is not part of the equation, and Jesus says as much. But the Canaanite woman doesn't take no for an answer. Her courage changes the course of the story. I think the worst consequence of the interpretive gymnastics that insists Jesus was just having a bad day or that he was testing her in the name of faith is that through that process, the agency and courage of the woman is shoved aside in order to make Jesus' actions more palatable and comprehensible to us. But if we truly are Christ's followers who seek to be disciples in word and deed, then perhaps we should slow down and imagine Jesus being confronted by this Canaanite woman and contemplate on how we would have responded if we were in his place. We obviously have no personal experience to know what a Canaanite is like, and we can only know secondhand about the historical relationship and social dynamics between Gentiles and Jews in first century Palestine. But we do know firsthand what it is like to live in a country where the system is set up to protect and provide advantages to white people, while other people of color and backgrounds have to fight and struggle for everything they need and desire. This may seem to some like a contrived comparison, but bear with me. Warren Carter, in his commentary, Matthew in the Margins, puts it this way: the scene locates Jesus in a world of ethnic, cultural, economic, political, and religious barriers. Sound familiar? Carter continues, this Gentile woman is geographically on the margins of Israel and is, as a Gentile, marginal in Israel's worldview. As a Canaanite, a member of a cursed people, destined to be subjugated as slaves, she belongs to a people dispossessed by Israel's occupation and possession of the land. Sound familiar? Cursed people, a dispossessed people, a people forced to the margins of society to be subjugated. In our own context, this could describe Native Americans who were dispossessed of their land, very nearly exterminated, and remained marginalized in every way imaginable. Or it could describe Black Americans who were forcibly brought to this land, condemned to hundreds of years of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and who still face the threat of violence each and every day. Or it could describe Latin Americans who've been the victims of our dispossessing economic and foreign policy and who still suffer prejudice and violence through our immigration policy. Or it could describe Arab Americans who've been the most recent segment of society to face the brunt of American prejudice in dangerous and damaging ways. My professor, Nancy Bowen, often likes to say that sometimes the Bible feels like it was written thousands of years ago, but sometimes it feels like it was written just last week. The Canaanite woman isn't even from last week. She's living right here among us today, in every person or group who has to face marginalization, racism, and violence. She ain't just a biblical character. She lives among us in Leslie McSpadden, the mother of Mike Brown, who cries out for justice in vain as she mourns the death of her son, who's been gunned down in the street by police officer Darren Wilson. She lives among us in Darlene Hyder, a Muslim mother who's been harassed for wearing her hijab so many times that she's forced to explain to her children why they must dress differently now when they go to the airport, because the country they move to harasses them and likens them to terrorists for simply existing as Muslims. She lives among us in Carol Gilham, a Sioux mother who must scrape by day in and day out on the reservation just to give her kids a fighting chance to survive in a world that once belonged wholly to her people. She lives among us in Maria, a Guatemalan mother who fled violence in her home country, only to be unjustly locked up in an immigration detention center with her young kids in America. These stories of heartbreak, racism, and injustice are sadly a dime a dozen, and our society's indifference and sometimes outright hostility is the culprit of it all. We, the people, have told each of them and so many more that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not for them, and that they can't even get the scraps of justice that might fall down to them. Which is why, in this time of Easter, we must remember who truly is the Lord of our lives and who is the liberator of all peoples. Now, I don't want to get it twisted. This is not easy to get right all the time. Remember, even Jesus in this story does not immediately heed the woman's words and grant her what she so desperately needs. But what makes Jesus different from the rest of the religious leaders of his day, the political and religious leaders of our day, is that even though he is affected by these prejudices and lives in a society controlled and formed by these prejudices, he doesn't ultimately let these prejudices define who he is. The text tells us that Jesus takes the risk of crossing the border into the ambiguous space between Galilee and Tyre and Sidon, to a place where other religious and political leaders would not go. In fact, right before this story in Matthew, Jesus had been talking and disagreeing with the Pharisees. I don't think this is a detail to be missed. Warren Carter describes the difference between Jesus and the Pharisees thusly: the Pharisees remain in their center of power, while Jesus moves and withdraws to Gentile territory. Jesus crosses the border and leaves a realm of comfort and relative privilege to go to a space where he can be challenged and transformed. It might seem awkward to think that the Son of the living God needs to be transformed, but don't close that door too quickly. We can only guess at what was in Jesus' mind at the time, but the story certainly shows that the Canaanite woman changes Jesus in a significant way. As theologian Letitia Guardiola Saenz puts it, quote, "This is a story of conviction and struggle in which a displaced woman reclaims her place at the table. The other that Jesus once treated as a dog is now giving him a lesson of human courage and love for life. The Canaanite woman has come to break the bread together with him as an act of restitution and humanization." What a vision of justice and reconciliation that is. The liberating love of God is bigger and more transformative than we could ever imagine, and its unique power comes from the margins. The Canaanite woman's history is a history of oppression on the margins, where she and her people have been left without much hope. But her confrontation with Jesus sharpens Jesus' focus and once again pulls him further into solidarity with the oppressed and what Kelly Brown Douglas calls the crucified class. The great faith of the Canaanite woman, then, is not only about her persistence and knowledge of who Jesus Christ is, but in helping Jesus discover more fully who he is, who he came to save, and how that salvation could be wrought. For us today, this means that we must look around ourselves, look around our neighborhoods, look around our cities, look around Richmond, step out of the seminary doors. Do we see any crucifying realities slowly sucking the life out of certain kinds of people? If we don't, we got to leave the center of our power and privilege like Jesus did in order to be confronted by the Canaanite women of our life and times. If we already see these crucifying realities of racism and injustice in full effect, then we must, like Jesus, begin to listen deeply to these Canaanite women, to understand what their reality is like, be in solidarity with them, and struggle for life together with them. The oppressed, crucified classes of society are where God's justice and peace comes in its transformative and beautiful fullness. The Canaanite woman reminded Jesus of this, and Jesus embodied this kind of solidarity and love even unto death on a cross. You see these crumbs under the table here? They aren't much. Just remnants left after the sumptuous feast is over. Not enough to sustain a vibrant life, just enough to survive and barely cling to life. The Canaanite woman took the crumbs that Jesus and his people had left her with and reminded Jesus that she was invited to his holy and redemptive feast, and that this feast doesn't have crumbs on the menu. The salvation and liberation of Jesus, proclaimed then and now, is available to all peoples of all races and all nations. Everybody, absolutely everybody, even Israel's historical enemies, even America's discriminated, disinherited, oppressed, and dispossessed, are part of the liberating reign of God and invited to the Lord's table to feast together. No exceptions and no excuses. The Canaanite woman made sure of that. As we leave this place today, I invite you afterwards to come up and take a crumb off the ground. You don't have to eat it. Just take it as a reminder. So that we may go in peace, but we may also go with eyes wide open, eyes to see injustice and suffering, eyes to see opportunities for blessing and healing, and eyes to see what God is doing in the world today. May God go with you, and may the peace and love of our Lord Jesus Christ lead you and bless you. Go in peace.